the second lecture in the winter series. It gives me great pleasure tonight to invite Tony Robson along to speak to us. I don't think he needs too much introduction from myself. You all know that Tony is well known for his work since he retired with the Stornoway Menty Trust and all the good deeds that you see around the town. I'm going to let Tony introduce himself and as to what he does, but I just thought I would regale you on what Lewis was like in 1800 when the Ettrick shepherd arrived here. It took him a week to cross the Munch, and then he set up board and luncheons in the Star Inn. During the night, he recorded that at least 3 fights broke out in his bedroom as drunken sailors arrived, and so the following day he decided to go somewhere a lot quieter. So he headed to Barracks to stay in the manse over there, and he recorded that 10 miles of road had been built, but the last mile is still to be made. So that shows you that, you know, in the years of the 18th century, that there were no real internal roads in Lewis apart from round Stornoway. Now I'm going to pass you over to Tony now, and I'm sure you're going to be quite entertained because he's got quite a number of slides to show you. Okay then, Tony.
Well, good evening everybody. Yeah, thank you Malcolm for that introduction. I'm a civil engineer for my sins, and that's why I'm here to talk to you. The reason that we're doing, well, I thought I'd do a talk is because a chap called Telford was a civil engineer, and it's the 200th anniversary this year of the Institution of Civil Engineers. So the institution, which is in London, and you know where these places, and that's where all civil engineers sort of, the Institution of Civil Engineers is their body, their professional body, and it was formed by Telford 200 years ago. And there's been various things throughout Britain celebrating what he did. Now, 38 years ago, and a month today, I was a young graduate engineer. I was doing my professional exams and getting ready to try and get chartered, and to get what everybody if you're an engineer, a chartered engineer is your goal. You want to get. So I'm an MICE. I'm a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers. So 38 years ago, in order to impress my examiners, I decided I would do a paper called The Evolution of a Highland Road. And the reason I picked that was that part of my training was to work as an engineer on a road job, and you had to do site work. And I was in Plockton on the road between just from the Kyle Road going over to Strome Ferry, and I did about 2.5 years there. And having done that as an engineer supervising a road job, I thought, well, this is an interesting bit of road because it was a Telford road. And I thought, well, it would be interesting to look into the history of what had happened to that road. And I wrote this paper, which I did as one does when you're young and full of enthusiasm. So I did that, and I presented the paper in Newcastle in a competition, and I got myself a wee gonk for that, and that was that. So what I thought was 38 years on in a month, I thought, well, it is 200 years, and I would try and expand it a wee bit and also include not just the Highlands, but the islands as well, as much as possible. Okay, so that's why we're here. So I've been in the islands since 1980, when I was on this road in Plockton, I was the assistant resident engineer, and I worked for a very Presbyterian Scottish firm called Babty, Shaw and Morton, and you worked for Babty's and you served in the early days with Baptists, you had to pay to work for them. They gave you the privilege of learning the profession. No longer like that, but in those days it was like that. So I came up here as senior engineer to the Uists in 1980 and spent 10 years there, and went there with one daughter and left there with three, one of which is sitting at the back there. So we lived in Uist for 10 years, and then I've been up here since, as Malcolm says. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to take you through 300 years of road building and things happening in Scotland. I hope you find that of interest. It's quite a colourful story, I think, and I hope you enjoy it. So, right, what we're going to start with is basically 1689. Was a key date because it was the Glorious Revolution, and James II. Fred, do you want to sit and watch these slides from over there? You're all right? Okay. Right, we had a revolution, but it was basically James was deposed and his daughter Mary, married to William, became the monarch. And that revolution, basically, Catholics were denied the vote, Catholics could not sit in Westminster, Catholics could not be commissioned into the army, and the monarch was forbidden to be a Catholic or marry a Catholic. And that was the Glorious Revolution, and the monarch ruling has remained in place till 2015. So that was the start of trouble, because although a Stuart was on the throne, the two daughters, James's two daughters, Mary and Anne, were both brought up as Anglicans. So when William died, William and Mary came on the throne in 1689, and they ruled together till 1694, and William reigned until his death in 1702, when he was succeeded by Mary's sister Anne, and they had no children. So Queen Anne reigned, I'm just painting the picture here, 1702 to 1707. Queen Anne was Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland. And then you'll all know the Act of Union of 1707 meant that Anne became the Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. And although a Stuart, she and her elder sister Mary were raised as Catholic Anglicans. So trouble started when Anne died in 1714, because George, King of Hanover, hardly spoke any English, 57th in line to the throne, became the king. And that is the start of trouble which shaped Scotland and shaped the road system for reasons I'll tell you, because the Stuarts, the Jacobites, were raging, and trouble, basically deep resentment in the Highlands. And obviously, to start with James the Old Pretender, there was all sorts of, you had a clan system, you had armed clans, and from 1715, I think it was an act to forbid the carrying of shields and spears and anything like that. But there was trouble, and basically Scotland, well, the Highlands was occupied in effect by an army, and the Red Army, and trouble. 1689 was the first battle, and that was a Jacobite defeat at Dunkeld. There was an attempt to assassinate William in 1696, which was foiled. And in 1715, the Earl of Mar, there was a rising, and interestingly, the Seaforths in the castle here were involved with the Earl of Mar, but got a pardon, I believe. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was some reference, which I'll show you from one of the documents I have here that the Seaforths were granted some, they weren't executed or done in by the, but there was a battle at Glenelg, and the Spanish were involved. They were at Elandonnan Castle, and there was all sorts of trouble. And that was where I think it was William's, one of the Seaforths, was supposed to have been fighting for the Jacobites. And that's Elandonnan, for you'll all know that, 1719. And then, of course, there was also one I missed, was in 1708. The French sailed from Dover, headed to Scotland, and got into trouble and had to go back to France. They never landed. So there was and then in 1746, Culloden was, of course, a terrible defeat for the Jacobites, although in 1759 a French invasion unsuccessful. So a whole series of things was going on in that period. And Jacobite unrest, the Jacobite rebellions basically stimulated the first major road building project in Britain since the Romans, practically. And between 1725 and 1779, 1,100 miles of road was built by General Wade, William Caulfield, and I've spelt it, you'll notice it's spelt field sometimes, but it's Feld from Ireland. Both Wade and Caulfield were Irish, and Lieutenant Colonel Skene. So these principally, I think we need a click on that, that's it. So basically all this Jacobite trouble created an atmosphere of a need for repressing and controlling all you terrible Highlanders. And it was done it wasn't English, but it was, as we know, the idea that it was England v Scotland is not true at all. I mean, the Jacobite thing was more of the north, and the Edinburgh and the south were ambivalent, or certainly not necessarily on the they were more on the royalist side than on the Jacobite side. So military barracks were linked by some 1,100 miles of road, and these roads were 16 feet wide, narrower in places, and they were constructed with squads of 100 men, and they even had a drummer. So I have to maybe suggest that to the Bredens of this world, that you have a drummer keeping you going. And the roads were generally in straight lines, and as you saw in the previous slide, large stone, smaller stone. So you had the barracks, and the barracks, some of you, or I'm sure you'll all be familiar with, but Fort William, the remains of the one of Wade's, it's gone off there.
The bulb's gone.
There's forts in Fort William. There's the Ruthven Barracks. You've got what's happened to the pictures have stopped. You've got the barracks at Inverness. You know where Inverness Castle is? The barracks in Inverness was where the castle that you see now. There was another barracks that was burnt down, or it was demolished by Jacobite rebels in 1746. So that's in Inverness, but it was the first Fort George. Have we lost?
I'm trying to go in again.
So you had the barracks, and you had 1,100 metres of road, and then looks like the thing is. Oh well. Yeah. Anyway, we'll just so you had Fort George, you had Fort George 1, which was in Inverness, and then Fort Augustus, and then you had Ruthven, and they were all built in about 1720. I'll just turn that round. I don't know if you can see that, but I'll just show the barracks there. And Bernera Barracks, you know, in Glenelg, there's the remains of barracks there. And a huge barracks was built in Inverness, which you'll be familiar with, Fort George, which is huge. Those of you, I don't know, can you see that from here, anybody? Can you see that? All right, let's do it this way then. So you can see there's a serious statement here, because the size of the barracks that was built in Fort George was definitely a statement that if you're going to mess with us, this is what we're going to do to you, because the size of that is enormous. And although, ironically, that was probably the end of the... now, I don't know if you can see the network here, but I'll show that. Basically, you've got Wade's roads. You can see the black lines. They're linking the forts, okay? Is that everybody okay? Can you see reasonably well? And then Caulfield, who's never recognised as a big player, built far more road than Wade. Wade only built 200 miles.
Come on again, Tony.
Is it? Yeah. Oh, we're coming back to life again. Good. So... yeah, so here we go, right. So there's Wade, 1725 to 1740. And then Caulfield, loads more road. The dots are just to show each bit. And then second and thirdly, Skene and others finished off. So they're all the military roads that were built. And you hear today, I mean, the rest can be thankful. It's thank goodness for the military, because if it wasn't for that, the road would be closed. So, so that's really a picture of what went on, and that was triggered basically by the your Jacobite rebels needing to be sorted out. So General Wade, appointed in 1724, and he then carried on to 1740, and built 235 miles of road. Field Marshal Caulfield, initially Wade's right-hand man in 1732, took over in 1740, and he built 700 miles. Road building was disrupted by Bonnie Prince Charlie, and there was a bit of a disruption, and then Caulfield carried on, and Caulfield fought at Culloden. Colonel Skene took over in 1767 and completed a further 200 miles of military road. In 1785, there's an important date. So 1785, the responsibility for road maintenance was transferred from military to civil labour. So that was the start of civil engineering, more or less. And as a result of bad central and local management, sounds familiar, you know, the road network deteriorated. And over the next 25 years, squandering the labours of the three military. So things went downhill. And then one thing, we then get to basically post-military now, okay? Things went downhill, and generally the military suppression, if you like, had more or less wiped out the clan system, and everything had basically changed. And I would say that because of the loss of the clan system, then generally people started to join the army. There was a lot of mainly that people wanted to do something, so they joined the army and became a major player in the sort of Highland regiments and all of that. So as you got to the 1800s, there wasn't any Jacobite repression, and as I say, deteriorating conditions in the Highlands nearly caused reduced recruitment. So basically, coming up for 1800, you've had, after the military period, you then found that people started to think that life wasn't that great and emigrated, and the recruitment to the Highland regiments started to go downhill a bit, and they decided they needed to do something, and that was really the start of government getting quite concerned. In 1803 was Telford being appointed. Now, one thing that was written in 1786 was John Knox commented, this is something writing about roads in 1786. The location and width of this track was probably determined by sheep and cattle. Not that the sheep were that bad at road alignment, according to John Knox, who visited the Highlands in 1786. His comments regarding some man-made roads were that even sheep follow better routes, understanding levels better and selecting better gradients. So that was a comment in 1786. Now, in 1800, the coaches, there was an attempt, Telford commented in 1801, to give you a picture here, that before the commencement of the century, no public coach or regular vehicle of conveyance existed in the Highlands. In the year 1800, it was attempted to establish coaches between Inverness and Perth and Inverness and Aberdeen. But from the state of the roads at that period, it was found necessary to discontinue them after a short trial. So basically, you had the military thing and left the road system okay, then it went seriously downhill, and then you couldn't run a coach between Inverness and Perth, and that was pretty bad. So emigration, lowering number of volunteers for the army, the government decided I think you need to do something to this, otherwise it's going to go off again. So in 1803, Telford was appointed after a short period to basically construct Highland roads and bridges, harbours and canals. And you'll probably be familiar with his what he achieved, but I'm just going to go through. I think one thing we'll do is let's press this one. By the time Telford finished, he'd basically, if you see, his whole work was in the Highlands, and the dotted lines he improved were those roads that actually Wade did. So the network, and you'll see the islands. Unfortunately, Telford didn't come here. He did have some influence, because you'll be familiar with that Uig. There's a Telford church that was, I think, I'm not sure if the community bought it. I think there's a church, and there's one in Timiscary and Uist, another Telford church. So there are some churches, but apart from churches, of course, he did roads, and he had three key players as in one of these big programs. He had James Hope as his law agent, John Rickman in the House of Commons, and those three guys made an enormous impression on the Highlands after the military period. And they introduced a whole system, and I'm not sure if there's any chartered engineers or any engineers here, but Telford had really he introduced all those terms that any of us as engineers, measurements, valuations, certificate of completion, all the things that we all use today were introduced, and he handled the difficult contractors, and he didn't award tenders to people who were the lowest price necessarily because he didn't think they were good enough. All these things. He introduced a whole system of management, which was he was just a stonemason from the borders, and he did a really, really good job in not only building all this stuff, but actually introducing a whole new system. Now, one thing he did emphasize was that the construction of a Highland road is very different from that of a lowland road. The former being chiefly for the accommodation of Highland cattle, and to be free of hard substances which would injure feet. So he always insisted that that any of the material at the top of a road had to be less than a hen's egg in size, just to satisfy. So that was the this actually summarizes some of the other things that he did. He built, he did 40 harbours, 1,100 miles of road, 400, I think, 1,000 bridges. There's just amazing amount of work going on for one man in 22 years to manage all of that. And it had an enormous income. And you'll see, you'll see that one of the things is that the roads he was talking about were major ones for driving cattle. And you'll see this is the routes for cattle to Crieff and Falkirk. So all the cattle, you had the Industrial Revolution in Glasgow and Edinburgh, everybody needed to be fed. So everybody cattle were driven on all these routes to the focal point of Crieff and Falkirk. And that's where they were important at that stage. And apart from that, he did a lovely bridge there. He built the Caledonian Canal. And those familiar with Wick, Pulteney Town, there's whole buildings and stuff that he was responsible for. So, we are now coming to familiar ground, James Matheson. Now, I think I've just got something here in 1809, right, just about, we're just a wee bit further, and then I'm just going to go back to 1809 for what was happening here. The Long Island, in 1809, the Long Island only had 2 pieces of carriage road, finished in the summer of 1809, 15 miles from Stornoway to Barracks, and 7 or 8 miles made by Lord Macdonald in North Uist. So that's the roads in these islands, in Lewis, Harris, Uist. Both were made at the expense of the proprietors, last mentioned noblemen and Lord Seaforth, and without any government aid. So basically very little road. Okay, so in terms of the roads that were built by Telford, his roads were 16 feet wide. He floated some on wood. He estimated that a man, I don't know what men can dig now, but in 1830s, guys could dig 8 cubic meters of peat a day. That's quite a lot. If you imagine if everybody in Breedon's was expected to dig 8 cubic meters of peat a day, I think that would that's quite impressive. And rock was blasted using gunpowder, which was what they had to do in those days. There's no jelly night till 1914 or so. So on the Telford front, the roads that were built were called parliamentary roads, and the landlords had to pay half the money. So the landlord to the commission, what happened was an application by the landowners to the commissioners was initially required, stating that the road would be of great public or private utility, and the landowners were to pay half the expense of the project and also pay any difference, if any, between the engineer's estimate and the final cost. So it's quite... But despite that, there was a big network of parliamentary roads, not here, but over the rest of the Highlands. Okay, now we are getting into 1859. Okay, so we've mentioned James Matheson, right? James Matheson bought in 1840, correct me, that's about the date that he bought Lewis from the Seaforths. Yeah, there was 45 miles of road built by the Seaforths in 50 years. So by 1840s, we had 13 miles of road here in 1809. By 1840, we had 45 miles of road, okay? And he built 200 miles of road. So, and an extract here of the expenditure shows the money that he spent on, and you see he spent 25,000, which is a reasonable amount of money. And that shows what was spent. I'm sure you guys are familiar with quite a lot of this, but that's an extract. I'll show you the document in a minute once we get to 1900, but basically that summarizes what Matheson spent, and that was the position he spent money on. Familiar, the slip and chemical works and all these things. So he did have an impact here, a private enterprise. I've got documents for sharing with the Historical Society if they want any of the paperwork to do with this. So, military classification, right. You had the military road, then in the 1669 there was a thing called statute labour roads, which meant each man had to spend 6 days labour a year to look after the roads. Novel idea, isn't it? And then you had parliamentary roads, which were Telford roads, and then you had turnpike roads, which there weren't any here, but there was a lot of turnpike roads in the rest of Britain, and they were run by separate trusts who collected money, a bit like pay-as-you-go motorways, you know. And then county roads, and this is just, I won't get too boring about this, but basically in 1850 round was quite far-reaching. So the government, the best part of, there was a Road and Bridges Act 1878. Under this act, all roads in a county were brought under county road trustees. So that would probably have been what happened here, although it would be, I'll show you in a minute, Inverness and Ross and Cromarty up here. But there was the start of counties, and the county roads would have probably applied here. That would have been the way the money, I'm sure if Sandy was here he would maybe explain some of that. But so 1878, that act, and then this county thing, it said in extract here, the counties were first established in early Stuart times, but the Road and Bridges Act 1878 was the first principal statute that led to counties eventually taking over responsibility for roads and bridges. And one of their duties was, which we're all familiar with, or quite a lot of people will be, that statutory list of highways, of all public highways, was a requirement. So you know now there's the roads register Well, that started in 1878. And then the county roads, well, that basically became the people took over, the county trustees and eventually county councils. So, without getting too tedious about it, that's the way the counties, and you'll be familiar, Ross and Cromarty. So Harris was in Inverness, and you'll be familiar with that. So that was the county setup. Now, thanks to our MP and my daughter, we managed to extract a whole load of stuff from the Houses of Parliament to look at what happened here particularly, and we've managed to get a whole load of documents here, which I'm sure some of you may have been seeing, but the first one I'm referring to is a really interesting report, which is the Crofters Commission report, Social Condition of the People of Lewis in 1901 compared to 20 years ago. And this document is really interesting. It's full of the most amazing facts, which describes what Lewis is like in 1901 and just about anything you want to know. Population, it's very, very, very full of detail. It describes, there's a lot of information in here, and I'll give this copy I've already given a copy to Jessie, which is, I've got a PDF of it. If anybody's interested in this document and really wants to read it, there's so much information in here about the life in the islands. In terms of roads, it confirms that there's references to what I said about 1719 and the Seaforths. It confirms the Mathesons. It gives, that's where the information that I put on the screen a wee while ago. But it also details money being given for piers and for various funding of particularly fisheries. Scigaster Pier, there's a whole list of piers: Babel Pier, Breasclip Pier, Carlaway, Faltus, Carlaway, all listed with amounts of money spent, and really interesting reading. So basically a very interesting document full of information. And another one, Congested Districts Board, because basically the funding for Highlands and islands improvements was Congested Districts Board from 1900 onwards were funding and helping with footpaths, roads, piers, and it's all detailed in here. Okay, so one interesting fact for crofters, you always get diverted into things that have got nothing to do with roads, but as a cattle person, Department of Agriculture. Up to the end of financial year 1909-1910, we have purchased in all 534 bulls. Now, I don't know how many bulls the department has now, but 534 bulls. Also, stallions. There was a whole list here of the stallions which belonged to the board. Athol, they had all names: Roderick, Sir Arthur, and they're all listed as where they were. They were in all over the islands, but they're listing all the stallions. So you had huge number, but it's a reflection on how much cattle there must have been. I noticed an interesting thing here was that North Uist had 7 bulls, while Stornoway 1, Uig 1, Lochs 1. So there seemed to be more South US 5, so there was far more bulls down. They must have had more cattle in Uist, I think. Maybe not, I don't know. But really interesting stuff. And another document for you historical people to read, and they're welcome. I'll leave these, but I've got it in PDF form. They show that, but this is listing that there was grants, 75% grants for roads and paths in Lewis, which is quite good. And these were in conjunction with the county council. So interesting stuff. I can't go into everything, you'll all be asleep by the time, but let's get to 1914 now. Again, lists of the bays of Harris. Interesting one here. So we're at 1914 here. The question of the construction of a road through the bays of Harris has been under consideration for some years, both by the Congested Districts Board and the Board of Agriculture, but for various reasons the scheme was not proceeded with. Owing, however, to representations which were made to the board as to the destitution existing in some districts of South Harris, it was decided to proceed at once with the construction of a section of the proposed scheme extending from Urmard to the existing main road at Obe Lickerstow. Now, so they must have got going on the Golden Road. That was when it started. Probably they put it off long enough. All right, 1913. So I'm just going gradually up without getting. Then you've got money being spent, Congested Board, Department of Ag, Babel Winch, Shawbosh, Cheshire, Sordal, various roads and paths. I think the county councils were doing, but the other roads were funded by the Department of Agriculture. I think that was what under Congested Districts Board. So 1914, more stuff. Grants for public works in congested districts, and then you've got Torlham Road, well that's South Uist. The grants were 75%. Bernary Harris. Now, in terms of coming to 1930s, that's when they started surfacing, but I don't think anything was surfaced here until about 60s, 50s. I don't know. When did they start putting bitmac? Any ideas? 50s? Yeah, well it started obviously with vehicles, then it, now that's why I mention it here, because when I was with the Trust I used to do stuff to do with vehicles, and this is what, in 1919, this is Leverhulme. Leverhulme, there must have been reasonable roads here in 1919, because I've got a list of 31 vehicles with their registrations, and Ford lorry, Ford van, these are all Model Ts. Ford touring cars. A Ford touring car in a Harris accident, I think there's a photograph of that in 1921, is there not? You've seen a crash on the Clisham, I think. So a whole load of cars. He had Foden steam lorries, 5 tons. He had 4 of those. He had a Darracq car, which was sold to Lord Dunmore in 1921. He had a Triumph motorcycle. He had Ford vans in Leverborough. So there must have been a reasonable network after Matheson, because he was able to run 30 vehicles. Okay. And, oh yes, one little snippet of information here. One thing, he had all his vehicles painted lemon chrome with black trim. That's quite avant-garde, actually. That's quite trendy. You know, black fascia, black mud, lemon chrome. And there was hell on, because he sold one of the cars he got rid of, he sold to the butcher, who's probably Mr. Mackenzie, the butcher, got one of his cars, was sold painted yellow, and this car, so I have arranged for this car to be repainted some other colour at the company's expense. So the Chamberlain sold the car to the butcher, but it was in Leverhulme's colours, and it had to be taken back, painted black, presumably. So, but as a reflection of the condition of the roads here, there must have been a reasonable number for 20 or 30 cars and steam Fodens to be trundling about. So more or less that is, just quickly just check. In 1935, the one thing that was the Crofter County scheme came in, and that road that I was saying that I worked on in near Plockton was part of the Crofter Counties, and a lot of the roads, I think here probably there was Crofter Counties money being used to fund. So this just shows the road changes in road, which aren't that great really. Start with 14-foot road, which we're talking about. You had the 16-foot. 16-foot was Wade's specification. Telford was 14 feet with 1-foot verges, cleansed gravel, and then 1930s, same thing, covered in tar, same width, and then obviously latterly the more recent roads in the 60s onwards were 6 metres. They've now gone up to 7.3. So I think there's one thing here though I thought I would mention. In 1954, the Secretary of State for Scotland announced in the House of Commons £1 million for special Highland road programme. And it says here that a further section of Broadford Road in Skye or a further section on the Tarbert Rodal in Harris, but Inverness County Council subsequently decided on Broadford scheme. So in those days, Lewis Lewis and Harris didn't get the best deal, and I think that was the problem, that we were rather remote and spend the money somewhere else. So I think that's me just about reached the I hope that's given you a smattering of what's gone on. It's maybe be a wee bit jumbled, and I've got all this paperwork which I'm very happy to give somebody to have a look at if they'd like it. But essentially, I hope that gives you a picture of how things have developed, and the politics and the way it works. And anyway, I think that will do me for the moment. And one thing just to remember, that thank you to Thomas Telford, and we'll continue to celebrate his work as professional engineers. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.